Welcome to our first video. I'm just going to go over to a few kind of housekeeping issues, namely when our midterm exam is now taking place. I've brought you to our weekly schedule. You can see that our new date for the midterm exam, it's been pushed back a few weeks, is on October 26th in week 9. Note that this basically gives us a few more weeks and a little bit more content, and just be prepared for that. I'll also kind of ask you to look forward to week 11, where you can see that the essay is due. As it gets closer, we may be able to push that back, but I'm kind of wanting to give you some sense that there's going to be a few assignments forthcoming before Thanksgiving and the end of the semester mad dash that we're going to have. All right, let's move along to our discussion of audience from Hutchings' chapter. A key idea to keep in mind is that, as you know from reading the Hutchings chapter, it starts out with an elaborate discussion of whether there was a chainsaw brought to a screening of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This is an interesting moment because the whole idea of how reality, the reality of the film and the reality of the audience kind of collapsed. Why it would be a very dangerous thing for somebody to bring a chainsaw to a screening of a movie. It does show simultaneously that this person may have, in fact, been merely trying to show their support of the movie, or they could have been a psychopath. It's hard to know. Nevertheless, the sense that the audience is an active kind of participant in the viewing of the movie is brought forth by this example. This was, of course, an example that could never be proven and perhaps didn't even take place. But it does show that while creating horror movies, as we've been talking about all semester, there is a real focus on audience in terms of guaranteeing that people will actually come to see the movies. And that is a kind of an idea that shows how the audience has some power, particularly through their dollars and whether they're actually attending the movies. But this is something that has developed over time, and we're going to go through some of that development, how audiences were perceived, in particular ways beforehand, and now they've changed. We'll also be talking about how the critics reacted to a lot of the audiences. So without spending much more time, let's just dive in. A key thing to keep in mind is initially horror films took great efforts to get audiences involved by creating urban legends or experiences to draw people to the theater. This is something that there's even the possible example of shocking people in the audience or using sounds to create an immediate connection between what is happening on screen and the reality of watching. And that's just a key idea that before there were quite a few gimmicks to try and get people into the movie houses. These would have kind of entailed, as I think you read the one example of the Percepto, of perhaps never being proven, giving a little shock or tingle feeling to people in the audience at a particular moment in the film when one of the characters as in fright draws attention to it. And that just shows how the whole idea of the visual experience was then trying to be extended to another sense, namely touch, to generate a kind of total horror feeling, at least for those few members of the audience. But that is something that has changed now. We see now that a lot of films are most of the kind of geared toward the audiences through the buildup of advertisement. And frequently you can tell that a movie is going to be a stinker by the sheer fact of the saturation of advertisement. If you find yourself watching the advertisement for a horror film again and again and again, it's likely that it's not that great because the film producers are relying on the first week's box office revenue in order to break even, because they don't believe that once people actually see the movie and when critics actually see the movie, that people won't actually show up. So that's just a little tidbit, kind of to give you a sense of how to protect your hard-earned dollars. If there is a lot of advertisement again and again and again, say for like Insidious 5, you have a good sense that that's not worth your money. Wait for it to come on video or screaming. Okay, going back to Hutchins, why do horror audiences show up? Well, obviously, the sense of being afraid, the whole idea of being thrilled, because it reminds people that they're alive by the sheer fact that they are taken out of their comfort zone, and it's a shock to the habitual. Another reason why horror audiences show up, a sense of terror. Okay, a key idea also with why horror audiences show up is a sense of how they can be subjected to an experience that they would never have in their real life, and in the process identify with this subject making production. And so this is an interesting kind of element of how the audience, while watching a movie, is put in a particular position and given a particular subjectivity. And that includes, as we've talked about when we were watching the beginning of Halloween, actually identifying with the killer, which was a fairly novel thing. We were put in the eyes of Michael Myers as he was stalking his sister at the beginning of the movie, and while we didn't know exactly what was happening. Another thing is the role of victimization. While audiences, can be subjected, they can also be victimized, and we can identify with the victims, and yet go home and feel safe in our everyday lives. Another thing is the playfulness of horror films. Frequently, they may deal with real, dangerous and horrible situations, but they often are kind of cracking jokes along the way, and there's a certain kind of playfulness, or sometimes even, some kind of comic relief when dealing with some pretty serious issues. So this is fairly typical for horror audiences, and reactions by horror audiences, and where the horror films um, are actively trying to play with these reasonings. The key thing to also keep in mind is a central idea. Why are horror films treated with such derision by critics, despite what audiences do? Okay, and what do? They keep coming to the movies. So, we've talked in passing about how horror is not exactly a warmly received genre, and it hasn't won a ton of awards at the academies. So that really gives you a sense of a certain bias against horror films. And what the rest of our lesson is going to be trying to do is trying to understand where that bias comes from. Right? So one of the fundamental ways that a bias exists is through the distinction between high and low art. All right, this is a distinction that you may or may not be familiar with, but there's this idea of high art is art that is lofty and universal, and is supposed to speak to the human condition, and is created to try and better human beings. Greek tragedies would provide a great example. If you've ever seen a Greek tragedy, the whole idea behind it is there's a lesson to be learned. The audience is educated along with the protagonist who suffers the tragedy, and along the way we're consistently kind of supposed to glom certain lessons that are there to teach us how to be better people than we currently may be. And this is where art plays what's called a pedagogical or teaching function in order to create better people. And it is, has been historically assumed that only high art could do this. And another way of thinking about high art is the art that you would encounter in museums, right? In museums they're becoming increasingly more. They're making a lot more outreach to general populations, but historically museums were often kind of like religious places, and for the very privileged and the very few. And so it it reached a point where people didn't even think that they should be going to museums unless they were of a particular education and social class. And that is kind of showing you how this high art, low art distinction gets played out and in the space of a museum. Um, Low art, right, is popular art and merely tries to provide entertainment. Unlike the high art, which is there to try and educate you and make you a better person, low art is just kind of there for you to take a little escape. Uh, and it won't make you think. It will just kind of uh, allow you allow you some moments of entertainment, right? And well, for most of us, we may actually watch movies because we are interested in escape and entertainment. I'm really trying to mark that this high art notion was very dominant, particularly among the elites, and to kind of mark a fairly basic idea that a lot of the critics were in fact elites. So this became a kind of self-perpetuating system where high art was valued and low art would not be valued. And horror would be thrown into the low art category because it wasn't supposed to make you think. However, as we've been trying to explore all semester long, that's not the case, and the critics have gotten it wrong. And maybe the whole distinction between in high art and low art is a false one that we should be challenging. We certainly are in our class. If you're still struggling with this idea, a way of thinking about this is high art is a kind of serious art. All right, it's an art again that educates you and is supposed to speak to the human condition, whereas low art is a popular art. It's a kind of art of the people, and the people frequently are looking for escape and entertainment. So this is really just another way of trying to explain the high art low art distinction. Uh, a key thing that we've been discussing all excuse me for a second. I think the key thing that we've been discussing all semester long is that we're trying as we're trying to function almost like film critics, even though that historically they've not valued horror, insofar as we're trying to look for larger meanings in the films, all right? And sometimes the films may be some of the critics may have gone so far because they look for larger meanings of films than the directors or the creators ever intended. And in the process, they try to understand in profound, if simplistic terms, why people go to horror films. Okay, so the same way that critics have tried to, come up with descriptions for, um, you know, coming up with larger meanings in films, they've also tried to apply this same logic to why people are going to horror films. And so, you frequently have people make arguments like Robin Wood does that people go to horror movies to celebrate the disintegration of civilization, which is a kind of ridiculous claim if you think about it. I don't think most of you are going to a horror film for that reason. And If you could please turn with me to page 82 in Hutchings. You'll find a quote by Robin Woods from his Philosophy of Horror from 1986. And this is a quote that's based on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where he's provided some really interesting analysis of the movie and, looking for the larger meanings of it, some of which we'll talk about soon enough. And then he kind of shifts gears to talk about the audience. And I'll just read the quote, and please follow with me on page 82 at the bottom of the page. Watching it, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, recently with a large, half-stoned youth audience who cheered and applauded every one of Leatherface's outrages against their representatives on the screen was a terrifying experience. It expresses, with unique force and intensity, at least one important aspect of what the horror film has come to signify. The sense of a civilization condemning itself through its popular culture to ultimate disintegration, and ambivalently with the simultaneous horror wish fulfillment of nightmare celebrating the fact. Okay, I mean, this is, a quote where Woods has been offering this reading of the movie, and then he looks at the audience and their kind of the pleasure they're taking from some of the antics that Leatherface is up to. And he's kind of putting himself out, kind of suggesting that he's above all that and looking with horror at that, ironically, at the horror audience because they're laughing and taking joy in Leatherface killing these people. And so this is a kind of great example of the critic taking a kind of elitist position or a high art position, despite the fact that he's spent all this time kind of analyzing how important horror films are. And meanwhile, he still seems to have a certain ambivalence towards the audience. And we'll continue to talk about this audience, about this ambivalence. These elite arguments are also called highbrow arguments, okay? Because the idea is that these are elite people who are somehow better than average people. And just so you know, as Hutchings describes, many of the early highbrow arguments on horror audiences put audiences into two camps. This is really because these are the only people that actually go to these movies. The sadist only group, or SO, or the moronic audiences. So you really had two choices. You were either a sadist and therefore seemed to take pleasure in watching people in the pain of others. This is what a sadist does. Or you're a moron, and a moron is another way of saying you're not very smart. And so this is kind of giving us a sense of the highbrow elite arguments against horror films. Um, it also allows the critics to kind of distance themselves from these things because it's often they weren't necessarily celebrating an idea of sadism. The key thing that you see in these highbrow arguments is that the audience is other in these arguments because those who are speaking about horror are distancing themselves. They are somehow better than the horror audience. Another idea is there's a way in which film audiences are perceived either as passive consumers who are like lambs being led to a slaughterhouse by the directors that control all of the reactions to the movies. Right? This is one kind of argument that basically, the director's intention just kind of dictates how the audience reacts to it. And we're going to kind of take a step back from that because we know that ultimately the audience determines how it's going to react to the films. And while the director may want us to have certain reactions, one of the key things to keep in mind is audiences frequently play with that. So, historically, a lot of films that have been meant to be very serious and dealt with horror have been met by audiences who have laughed at these very, very serious moments. And this laughter doesn't mean that they are, to go back to the highbrow arguments, merely sadists or morons, but it's an attempt to try and show that, at moments when people don't know exactly what to do or how to feel, they may laugh. It's an automatic response. And we see this frequently with horror films when you're seeing things that are totally outside your comfort zone and are utterly irrational when you've been kind of socialized to be rational all of your life. It's almost an automatic response to laugh. And so, therefore, what is being called by elites a marker of sadism or being a moron may in fact just be a fairly basic human response to a confrontation with the unknown. Right? This is kind of my more generous reading of it. All of this is to say, just what I've just kind of been talking about, is a second way in which film audiences are perceived. They're given an active creative role and make the film about many other things than it was originally intended. And this is kind of a key thing with horror movies and basically, hopefully, all movies that you may go to. You may, in fact, utterly change the meaning of the movie because you are an active interpreter. This is something to keep in mind while we're doing our essays and our final paper, because ultimately the active interpretation is when you are active and creative in coming up with your own kind of reading of a movie based on some intellectual ideas and previous scholarship. Over the course of the Hutchings chapter, he engages an important film scholar by the name of Judith Main. And kind of what we're talking about is nicely articulated by her notion of spectatorship. And for Main, She identifies a difference between how films position or address their intended audiences and their actual reception. Okay, this is just another way of kind of trying to say that film directors make certain choices and they want the audience to to have and maybe perhaps have certain reactions in different scenes, or at least provoke certain responses, provoke an emotional response, perhaps rather than a rational response to a movie. Um, but they can do that all they want, and meanwhile the audience may actually do something very different. So this is a kind of the challenge always with audiences. And again, just to hit this point over, hit you over the head with this point, a fundamental way of thinking about this is if the directors or producers knew exactly what would work and bring audiences to movie theaters, uh, they would always be successful. If there was a tried and true formula that um, would work every time, and yet we know by all the box office failures that that's not the case, right? And sometimes we are subjected to, uh, this market logic because they're trying to get people into the seats and they're trying to think about, try to do it with tried and true formulas. We'll talk more about this in the next video, but that's why we have so many focuses, so much emphasis on serials in a lot of the horror films, because again another way in which the movies are trying to actively uh, position or address the intended audience by giving them something that's familiar, and yet we know that sometimes sequels don't work. Or to quote the movie Scream, which we'll be talking about in the next, uh, I'm sorry, to quote Scream 2, um, sequels suck, all right, which is an ironic moment in the movie Scream 2, which of course was a sequel to Scream 1. All right, and this is getting back to an issue, going back to an issue we've been talking about all semester long. Why do people like to be shocked and look for something new? And what we notice with great horror films is that they introduce new shocks. Okay, so um, a key thing to keep in mind is a lot of horror films that are just too radical and too new may be off-putting to audiences because they're not sure what to do with it. And that's some people have reacted that way to some of the films of David Cronenberg. But you know, one of the key reasons why you may go to a horror film is you're looking to be shocked. You're looking for something that's going to take you out of your usual habitual viewing experience. Right? Conversely, we also may enjoy the familiarity of horror conventions. The very fact that we are, replicating something, a tried and true formula that we're already kind of keyed into. And we may, in fact, revel in the novel ways of doing them. We'll talk more about this with how the Scream movies, which are ironic commentaries on the horror movie, basically. And they take all the conventions, they put them on display and kind of poke fun at them and take issue with them. Um, the other kind of fundamental idea to keep in mind is, horror films have their own fan base. Got to keep in mind that the whole idea of a fan comes from the root of the word fanatic. And when we think of fans, whether they be sports fans or fans of particular genres, um, whenever we think about why there is a fan base where people are, willing to kind of put aside their rationality in order to support something, we're getting into kind of interesting uncharted territory. And we're also getting into kind of larger social issues of how we understand identities, and particularly the identities of the audience. And a way to kind of maybe explore this and explain this is to go into queer and gender theory. All right. And I'm doing this not only to discuss audience here, but going back to some of our earlier discussions on difference, I want to remind us, that, queerness and gender are elements of difference from the dominant norm. again, just to remind you about the whole discussion we had about difference. Difference is not so much based on identities per se, that you have one identity instead of another, but based more on power relations. Are you in a dominant relationship to power, or a subordinate one? Or in other words, are you oppressed, or are you part of the norm? And we talked about this before with race and class, and we brought up gender. We brought up gender with the whole idea of patriarchy, misogyny. We've talked at length about these issues, and we've actually talked, in somewhat about some of these ideas from queer and gender theory. But I just want to take it a little bit more, a little more specific here, because going back to some of our discussion of difference before, gender identities and subjectivities are not natural or fixed, but they keep changing. All right? We talked about this in terms of how identities and subjectivities are more situational or context specific than being something that's timeless and universal. We discussed this in terms of at various moments you have the identity of being a boss, a student, uh, a father, a son, a mother, a daughter, aunt, all these different identities that you inhabit. And you act slightly differently in each one of them. If you are a boss, you have to act in a very different way than you would uh, when you're a student, or when you're a parent, hopefully. And so this is something that you're already doing, and we're really trying to kind of provide language for it. One of the great kind of gender and queer theorists is a woman by the name of Judith Butler. She's a professor of rhetoric at the University of California at Berkeley. And she came up with this theory that is really instructive, because if we can think about gender in this way, all right, we can think about all kinds of other identities in this way. And she describes gender as a performance. Okay. Now, why would this be kind of a radical idea? Well, when you look at gender, if you think about gender or sexuality, going back to some of the things we talked about with psychoanalysis, you can look at people and recognize certain biological differences. Some people have some type of equipment, and other people have different type of equipment. It's kind of a biological fact. And yet, all the ideas of what it means to be a man or a woman, or masculinity and femininity, are actually not natural, but produced by society. And a lot of them are fictions, and fictions that we are forced to kind of create our own identities against. And so Butler, to kind of acknowledge the fictionality of these productions of gender, and notions of masculinity and femininity, has kind of taken it to the next step to ask us to think about how gender itself can be performed. And in her first kind of book about this issue, she uses the drag queen and transgender existence as a way to embody this. Okay, because a drag queen, just to be very kind of obvious, may in fact be biologically male, but will perform femininity to the up to nth degree, so that when you watch a drag queen, it's not like it's an understated kind of the drag queen is not trying to be an understated woman. The drag queen is kind of representing womanhood in its most kind of uh, over-determined femininity, and kind of in very kind of sometimes in very outlandish ways. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, try watching RuPaul sometime, and you'll get a very distinct sense. It's not like you're watching, uh, a fairly typical representation of women, even though all the contestants are in fact biologically men. And so this shows how gender can be performed, and provides a kind of instructive way of thinking about identities as performances. And for our purposes, it's really helpful for thinking about film. And we've talked about this in terms of the various identities that we've occupied over the course of the viewing of a movie. And we've gone over these ideas with Linda Williams and Laura Mulvey and Carol Clover. And we'll be going over some more of these ideas with the slasher and the post slasher more explicitly. But for our purposes right now, and we'll return to these ideas, there is no collective identity for a horror audience. So to try and identify the fan base very, directly is a kind of lost venture. Uh, it isn't naturalized. It isn't fixed. Okay, uh, and much like when we try to reduce people to their gender or to reduce people to really reductive concepts of masculinity and femininity, we reduce the complexity of the fan base and to audiences. And so any effort to write about audience that doesn't try to acknowledge that complexity, which Hutchings does in this chapter, and I will admit this is a kind of frustrating chapter at some level. It doesn't really engage a lot of films, and it is a challenging chapter. But whenever we're thinking about horror audiences, we should be very wary uh, uh, in our ideas of what comprises a horror audience, um, precisely because it's oftentimes performed with each horror film, just to be very direct. Um, and this is because of two fundamental points. People react to films differently. It's just kind of a fairly obvious point that nevertheless needs to be restated. There is no predetermined way to address a horror film, and it's something to just keep in mind that we may react. Just to give you a sense of how this can change over time, you could watch a horror film the first time and absolutely hate it, and then you watch it a second time and you're loving it, and you're seeing all these things you missed the first time, right? And the key thing to just keep in mind is you may have been exposed to certain ideas about the horror, about the film that you weren't familiar with when you saw it. And in the process, you've kind of changed your reaction to it because your own knowledge has changed. And in the process, you have changed in the act of viewing, right? And so this is a very concrete way of thinking, and I hope this happens with you. For those of you who hated the birds, I hope on if you go back to it, you'll perhaps appreciate the movie after our discussion of it. With the understanding you don't have to love it, but just there's a lot more going on than we may have initially thought, and it's because your identity has changed because of new knowledge about it, as well as what you may be focusing on while watching the movie. Right? Anytime we watch something the first time, we may miss a lot of things. And then when we talk about them, all of a sudden it directs our attention. And so we see things that we missed beforehand. And, or things that were annoying to us may now make more sense. And that's why another key idea, and this is something that kind of already talked about, but why we see so many horror conventions in movies, and this familiarity of these horror conventions can be reassuring, and the audience looks for them, and that's why people become fans, right? Because we're looking for difference in the horror film, but we do also like and respect when we're watching a movie and it does a very good job of taking a convention that we've already become very familiar with and does something new with it. And it's a great thing to talk about. So those 2 points, people react to films differently, and the familiarity of horror conventions can be reassuring the audience look for them, are 2 aspects of the fan base, the fanatic base for horror films that we want to just keep in mind. Okay, that is the end of our discussion of audience. For now, I'm going to go ahead and end this discussion. If you want to go take a break or take a breather or wait many days later, you can go ahead and click on the next video, which will be devoted to Hutchings' chapter on the slasher and post-slasher. Thank you.